本期视频是3月21日新加坡外交官和学者、前联合国安理会主席马凯硕在纽约参加亚洲协会政策研究所的一档谈话节目的节选。谈话中，面对亚洲协会美中关系研究中心副主席奥威尔不怀好意的提问，马凯硕为中国辩护，侃侃而谈，尽显外交家风范。我们来看看他是怎么说的吧。
I want to start with Kishore and then turn to Orville for some opening remarks. What, from your perspective, are the U.S. and China competing over, and why? What kind of end state do you think that these two countries hope to achieve in terms of their role in the world, but also their relationship with each other? So over to you.
Thank you, Rory. First, let me begin by thanking Hamid and you for welcoming me back to the Asia Society. I do feel like this is almost my second home because I first came to the Asia Society in 1984, 40 years ago, when I was first appointed Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and I used to come here all the time. So to come back here is like coming back home. And so to answer your question, Rory, I think before you can answer the specific question about the direction of US-China relations, it's important to emphasize that we are dealing with it within a very, very different global context. And we have to understand this different global context if we're going to understand the dynamics that are also driving the US-China relationship. And there are at least three fundamental ways in which the world has changed now. Firstly, to put it very bluntly, the 21st century, where most of the US-China competition will take place, will be the Asian century. Now, what do I mean when I say it's going to be the Asian century? It means that the shift of economic power is going to move to Asia. The largest economies will be in Asia. And just to illustrate that point, in the 1960s, not so long ago, out of the top 5 economies, 0 were Asian. 0. Today, 3 out of the top 5 are Asian. And that future growth, as you know, is going to come from Asia. So that's one big shift that is happening. The secondly, on the geopolitical front, clearly we are moving from a unipolar world to at least a bipolar world. And I like to say that it's actually a bipolar world in a multipolar sea, because lots of other new powers are emerging, becoming more assertive. And so the unipolar moment that the United States enjoyed at the end of the Cold War is gone. But many people haven't adjusted to the fact that it is gone, and that you now have to live in a world where you have to contend with peer powers and other significant powers who are not necessarily going to bend to the wishes of the great powers so easily. So it's a much more complex world that we have to deal with. And thirdly, an equally important point, in the cultural dimension too, we are seeing some fundamental shifts that are happening, where we've had a world, in a sense, that has been dominated by one civilization, Western civilization, for the past 200 years, and Western states, as you know, colonized the whole. 100 years ago, if you were sitting here in 1924, the West ran the whole world effortlessly, right? Now you have a multi-civilizational world where civilizations that have been dormant are re-emerging and coming back in strength. So even on the cultural front, it's a different world. So within this larger global context, we are also seeing the US-China contest. So why is it happening? The reason, quite simply, is that the United States is doing what exactly any number one power would do when it sees the emergence of a competitor. It makes sure that the competitor doesn't overtake it, so it is pushing it down. That's what all great powers have done. So what the US is doing is not surprising. It's predictable. And if you put X or Y, that's exactly what will happen, because the US has been used to being number one. It doesn't want to cede its place to another power. But at the same time, while this is predictable and expected, what is not clear to the rest of the world that is obviously watching this contest and is very worried about this contest, what exactly are the main strategic goals of the United States in this contest? And this, frankly, as I say in my book, Has China Won? That insight I got from Henry Kissinger in a one-on-one conversation when I was writing my book, Has China Won? And Hamid, to some extent, you alluded to it in your remarks too. So, for example, is it the goal of the United States to stop the economic growth of China? Maybe that's why you have trade tariffs, chips, sanctions, and so on and so forth. Is that the goal? Can't be done. Or is it the goal to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? Again, I'll explain later, it can't be done. Or is it the goal to do what the United States did with the Soviet Union, contain it effectively, leave it confined to a small universe, and have it disengaged from the rest of the world? Again, as I'll explain later, it can't be done. So then at the end of the day, what the world is asking is, what exactly does the United States want to accomplish in this contest, and what will be the end game?
Okay, fantastic. Well, you've already put a lot on the table for us to come back and discuss, including fundamental changes, the rise of a multipolar system, the economic power and dynamism of Asia, new cultures, which I think is a really interesting point we should circle back to, but also raised a lot of questions about U.S. strategic goals. So, Orville, could you give us your perspective? What are the U.S. and China competing over, and why? What does the U.S. hope to achieve with this, and what is the end state that we're looking for?
Well, it's always a great pleasure to talk with Kishore, because it immediately makes me think in ways that I don't normally have to think. The first thought that occurs to me after hearing your remarks is this. You ask, what's the United States' new strategy post-1972, I guess we could call it an engagement. I would like to ask you, what do you think China's strategy is? What are they after? Because actually, this is a dance between two partners. It isn't just up to the United States, as I'm sure you would agree. So what do you think China is after? And if I may ask you a question, what power with great power pretensions adopts wolf warrior diplomacy, who antagonizes Canada, Sweden, Norway, Australia, India? I could go on. And why? What's going on here? How is that in the advantage of anybody, much less China?
By all means, go ahead.
I was looking forward to the opening remarks of
Forgive me, Kishore,
I thought you would have some 7 minutes of prepared remarks.
I
that
don't
would give me some time to
bait.
think. But I'm very happy, Orville, to answer your question. And if you don't mind, again, forgive me for doing this. When you talk about our world and how the world sees, especially what China's goals and strategies are, I want you to bear in mind a very important statistic, which is that 12% of the world's population lives in the West, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And let me make one point very clearly and very boldly at the very beginning. How the 12% views China is not how the 88% views China. And so, for example, when you ask about what is China trying to accomplish, and if you want to if I can share with you what I pick up from my conversations with my fellow Asians, with Africans, with Latin Americans, they see that China is trying to come back once again as a strong civilization, which it once used to be. And China, he knows better than I do. He's the China expert. By the way, I'm not a China expert. Let me emphasize that one time. Immediately, I'm a China observer. And of course, we have to be China observers because in Southeast Asia, as you all know, geographically, the power that is going to have the greatest impact on us clearly is China. Just sheer proximity. Just as Latin America will live in the shadow of the United States of America. Southeast Asia has to live in the shadow, actually, of China and India, I must also emphasize. So our perspective and that of other Africans is that we've seen this civilization for 4,000 years go up, go down, go up, go down. And so the return of China is just part of a long 4,000-year history of dynastic cycles. And when the Chinese civilization goes down, it can go down very, very badly. And I think Orville knows better than any of us that they went through one of the worst centuries, the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. But it's not normal for the Chinese civilization to underperform for so long. It's much more normal for them to come back after a while. So what we see, therefore, from, let's say, from Southeast Asia, is the return of a civilization that we have seen for centuries go up and down. So this is a natural return. Now, so when China tries to claim a place in the world as one of the great powers, is a perfectly natural development. Now, you mentioned things, you use words like wolf warrior diplomacy. And what's interesting is that while the term wolf warrior diplomacy is so frequently used in the Anglo-Saxon media, and as you know, the Anglo-Saxon media, let's be very blunt about this, has a very jaundiced view of China, and the rest of the world discounts what the Anglo-Saxon media says about China. What the rest of the world does is to look at what China does and then deal with it. And at the end of the day, you will notice that countries have a choice. Do they want to trade with China, or do they not want to trade with China? And if you look at the deeds, China today does far more trade with the rest of the world than the United States does. By the way, we do want to have trade with the United States too. But trade, as you know, is a voluntary activity. But it benefits the countries that do it. So you take a country like Brazil, which is much, much closer to the United States than it is to China. 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. So why shouldn't Brazil have a normal trading relationship with China? So you can see, therefore, the point I'm trying to suggest to you is that if you look at many of the countries in the global south, not all, at many of the countries in the global south, they're very happy to have normal relations with China, and they have no difficulties. The difficulties have come, as I said, primarily between the United States and China for understandable reasons. This is what would happen when you have a great power shift. And I actually think that in some ways, just as what the United States did towards China was predictable, China's responses towards the United States are also predictable.